I have been lucky enough to serve as a research assistant and now teaching assistant for Dr. Dan Byman. For those of you who don't know Dr. Byman, he is a professor in the School of Foreign Service as well as the Vice Dean for Undergraduate Affairs. Dr. Byman was previously the director for the Security Studies program from 2005 to 2010. He is a senior fellow at the Center for Middle East Policy at the Brookings Institution and has held positions in various other think tanks and within the government over his illustrious career. Illustrious, so illustrious. Dr. Byman is also the author of well over half a dozen books, including his most recent that released this summer, which is Road Warriors, Foreign Fighters in the Armies of Jihad. Foreign fighters, obviously a hot topic and kind of a contentious issue for governments around the world right now, here in the US, as well as in Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. But as Dr. Byman's book points out, this is hardly a new phenomenon. Road Warriors takes readers through the evolution of the jihadist foreign fighter movement, starting in the Afghan Jihad of the 1980s, through Bosnia, Chechnya, and now to the fallout of the mostly collapse of the Islamic State's caliphate in Iraq and Syria. But as he makes very clear, the issue is unlikely to disappear anytime soon. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Byman. We're going to dive right in. We'll probably talk for about an hour or so, and then we'll leave a half hour or more at the end for questions from the audience for anybody who has questions. We're going to start, I think, where most conversations in classes about terrorism or involving terrorism start, which is definitions. So what is the definition that you used for your book?
So I should begin really by thanking Sam. So any of you who have had the misfortune to be a research assistant or a professor know that much of the true lifting is done by people who are named very quickly in acknowledgement. So I will publicly say what I've also said in written form. So thank you very much for all your excellent and hard work. With that, when we talk about definitions, with a foreign fighter, there's kind of a simple conceptual point, which is an individual who travels to another country to participate in a war there. I would emphasize two, I'll say, caveats or additions to that basic definition. One is that the individual is not doing it for money. So we're trying to differentiate this individual from a mercenary. Now they might be paid, right? So it's not trying to say that they will be completely unpaid, but that the primary reason they are there is not financial, and that's not the inducement. The second thing I would mention would be that I have a very broad view of what fighting constitutes, right? So there's obviously picking up a gun and participating in killing or shooting. But a lot of it is participating in the broader logistics networks that make transnational terrorist groups in particular so unusual and often so effective. So it could be on the propaganda side, it could be on the fundraising side, it could be on cyber operations, it could be a host of things that are a little different from the pure kinetic side. The last thing I would say, and here I'm kind of fudging a bit, is I'm also very interested in individuals who go abroad to be part of organizations simply to train out. So often individuals go abroad and they're not playing a huge role in the fighting itself, but they are partaking in what the group offers in the war zone. And for terrorism purposes, that often has tremendous consequences.
As we kind of mentioned, what's obvious from the book is that foreign fighters aren't a new phenomenon. But why do they matter, and how does the jihadist foreign fighter movement compare to other foreign fighter movements?
So there are a couple things that I'll mention as a way of prelude. Right? So if you look throughout the 20th century, even well beyond it, you see individuals who join these wars. Right? Davy Crockett, who, when I was a little kid, I used to think about, right, he was a foreign fighter. Someone goes to this republic called Texas, right? And it's really kind of barbaric, backward place, right? And joins a war there, right? And it eventually succeeds, so we don't think of it in those terms. I grew up one block away from Lafayette Street, where named after the Marquis de Lafayette, who was a French aristocrat who joins the American Revolution, right? So this is kind of a storied tradition. In my book, I have a quote from a foreign fighter who talks about it being the most meaningful thing he's ever done in his life, that when it came to killing, that somebody had to be one of those somebodies, right? He felt tremendously responsible to be actively involved in the violence. And that was Vidal Sassoon, the famous designer, right? Few of you in this room will know this reference, but a sharpshooter for the Israeli army was a woman named Ruth Westheimer, the sexologist. So you have a really unusual array of people who join these groups. International communism drew tens of thousands of people to fights in Spain, and the Russian Civil War, had a large number. So, large numbers. That said, what makes this unusual, I would say, is two factors. One is that when these people have returned from the fight, some have been involved in international terrorism. The concern about people who joined communist insurgencies in the past was that they would be involved in subversion. If they would be a fifth column for the Soviet Union or for some other communist power and use their experience overseas to subvert the country they're in. Here we're talking about terrorism. And if you look at the 9/11 attacks, the 2015 Paris attacks, the 2005 London attacks, the 2004 Spain train bombings, all these involve foreign fighters. So some of the most deadly terrorist attacks that we think about from the jihadist movement involve foreign fighters. It's also unusual because these people at times become professional jihadists. So going back to the very creation of Al-Qaeda, part of what bin Laden and others were trying to do was say, we have this foreign fighter movement. What do we do with it? Right? We have all these people who are coming to Afghanistan. Can we harness it in a way, institutionalize it, and perpetuate it so we can use it in other conflicts? And they start to develop, I'm happy to go into this, kind of the nucleus of kind of a foreign legion, where individuals will go where Al-Qaeda is, they'll train up, they'll become indoctrinated, and then they'll return to wherever they're needed and fight there. So it's not a one-cause thing. It's individuals who are motivated by an ideology and then become, in their eyes, warriors, either to stand the battlefield somewhere or to come back and do terrorism.
So these individuals who become radicalized and decide to become foreign fighters, where are they coming from? What are their demographics? It's hard to fit a profile, but what do we see broadly?
So a lot of it is, it depends. And it's going to depend first and foremost on the wars we're talking about. Right? So when we talked about Afghanistan, there are a lot of people from Saudi Arabia and Yemen who were very prominent. But you had lots of different groups going there in the 1980s and early 1990s for very different reasons. So a bunch of Egyptians show up, but they're really hiding out from their own government. Right? So they're not going to fight because they believe in the Afghan cause. They're more like, oh my God, we're being killed in Egypt. Hey, there's a place we can regroup. Let's go there. Right? So they're going to Pakistan along the Afghan border for a very different reason than a young Saudi might be going because he wants to help fight Soviet communism. We start to see a lot of Maghrebis, people from Libya, Tunisia start to show up, and that becomes very pronounced in Iraq. In the Syrian civil war, it's all over the map, right, literally. So Central Asia has thousands of volunteers. There are going to be 40,000 in total that show up in the Syrian civil war. And that's going to be more than all the other jihads combined. It's more than Afghanistan, Iraq in 2003, Somalia, Mali, more show up for that single one. And you have about 6,000 come from Europe. Right? And one statistic I heard, I still have to kind of carefully crunch the numbers on this, though, is if you thought of Europe's Muslim population only, then Europe would have a higher per capita participation rate than most countries in the Muslim world. Right? So, but again, just focusing on one aspect of the population. You still see lots of Saudis showing up. You see lots of Libyans and Maghrebis, but the demographics vary a lot. So there was a study done that looked at compared different communities and said, in North Africa, it tends to be people who are a bit poorer, who have job problems. In Saudi Arabia, it tends to be people who are more secure in society, who are a bit richer. And there's going to be a lot of variation by conflict. And to make this a bit complex, and to go back to your initial question about definitions, there's a big question about diasporas. Right? So if you think about the conflict in Somalia, There are a lot of people fighting there who are not born in Somalia. But what if they're born in a refugee camp across the border in Kenya, right? To Somali parents, are they Somali? I kind of think of them as not really foreign in a profound sense. What if they're part of the Somali diaspora in the United Kingdom, right? And English is their first language, right? At some point the diaspora ceases to be part of the country and becomes a truly foreign country. But some countries attract a lot of diaspora fighters, and Somalia was a big one, where a lot of people who go had some connection to Somalia for familial or heritage reasons. So I'm not giving you an answer, right? Other thing I would say is demographically we see some changes, right? So for the most part, this is almost entirely a young male phenomenon. Okay. However, there's a bit of an exception with the Islamic State, where we start to see women go in two capacities. One is that they go as part of a family unit. Right? What made the Islamic State's pitch different was it said, in order to be a good Muslim, you have to live in a Muslim society. And there's only one Muslim society, right? And that's here. So if you're thinking about just, if you put on your own caps as potential or actual fathers or mothers, right? You want your kids to be raised in a good place, right? So in the eyes of people who believe this ideology, of course you bring your family, right? So we saw women going in that capacity. But we also saw women going as volunteers. And they play roles in logistics. And part of them were kind of eager for the life of jihadi bride, right? And that sounds kind of odd, but there was a lot of propaganda on the score. So we saw not huge numbers relative to the numbers of men who went, but we definitely saw numbers in the hundreds, right? Which would be large by any other scale compared to other conflicts. Other things. We also saw a lot of people who had a prison background, if you look at people in Europe. So it's people who had either a prison background or some contact with law enforcement. So they might have had a few drug arrests, things that were relatively minor. But that was a much higher risk factor than in previous conflicts. Europe in particular has a number of organizations that are pretty radical but ostensibly peaceful. So the idea of calling for the rule of a very, very puritanical form, an austere form of Islamic law, and abolishing democracy. Right? There are organizations in Europe that call for that. And that's not true in the United States, right? There's no Americans for Sharia law sort of organization, but there is the equivalent in parts of Europe. So people who've gone through those ranks are more likely as well. In the United States, Peter Bergen, who's one of the great kind of scholars of this whole terrorism phenomena, he wrote a book before the Islamic State talking about called the United States of Jihad, so it's focused on the United States. He talked about how there was no profile, right? And he said the line, who fights for jihad, is somewhat like asking who drives a Volvo, right? You're not going to get a single useful answer to that. However, with the Islamic State, a huge number of the people who went from the United States were converts to Islam, almost 50%. So that was a very different demographic than the kind of traditional one we think about. And people who were kind of, I think, both fervent in their faith, but also easily swayed, and that made them more susceptible.
You talked a little bit about this at the beginning here, that not everybody is a foreign fighter per se. Not everyone's going up and picking up a gun and showing up on the front lines. So what are the other roles that are options for people to pick up, and then what impact does that have on the groups and then on the battle space itself when large numbers of foreign fighters show up?
So a lot of the people who go to join, they're excited about the propaganda, they have this kind of video game image of the conflict, and they want to go to fight, right? And so actually a lot of people are disappointed by the reality of what they face. Right, and that's for a number of reasons. First of all, especially if you are coming from a developed world environment, showing up in a place like Somalia, a place like Afghanistan, is really hard, right? That it's just a fundamentally different and much harder day-to-day existence if you're used to air conditioning, right? If you're used to a soft bed, if you're used to steady food, right? It's very difficult for people to adjust. Add to that, this is a difficult part of a difficult country, right? This is you're in a war zone, you're with a group that often has very bad logistics, you have lots of problems. So if any of you are interested in kind of amusing jihadi reads, Omar Hamani was an American who was from Daphne, Alabama. And he goes and joins the Shabab and becomes one of their chief English language spokesmen. And he's really funny, right? His memoir is really funny. And he says, you know, we would pray for martyrdom because the bugs were so bad. You know, and he talks about, you know, you'd be driving down a Somali road and there'd be some Somali farmer kind of walking very slowly with, you know, big burden passing your Jeep as you're going down the road, right? Because the roads are so bad, right? And so a lot of people show up, really have a hard time adjusting, and are not particularly useful from a military point of view, right? They're untrained, they can't hack it, and so they have real problems. Also, a lot of people show up, even if they can hack it, don't speak the language, right? So a number of people in this room have military experience, right? It'd be really hard to command and work with troops if you don't speak the same language. Right, really basic point. So the Islamic State tended to group people in language groupings. So the French and Belgians were grouped together, along with a lot of the North Africans, because they all spoke French. Right? It caused huge problems because France's solution to its foreign fighter problem was to kill its foreign fighters. So they ended up killing a lot of Belgians, which is not their solution. And so, you know, little tension going on there, right? So they often don't fit in on the battlefield, and thus are not often particularly welcome by many of the fighters themselves. They have a lot of propaganda value, though, right? The idea that Muslims from around the world recognize the superiority of our leadership, and they've traveled thousands of miles just to be part of our fight. But that means a lot, right? It validates the group's message. It means a lot, at times, to the rank and file. Also, you can train people. Right? And people get trained, and in some cases it's very good training, and in some cases it's really bad training, but warfare itself is a form of vetting people, and, you know, half the people die, but those who remain, you know, actually learn how to fight, right? Otherwise they'd be dead. So that kind of incompetence problem can be overcome in different ways. But they also cause problems for the groups because they tend to be more extreme, right? So part of it is they're very zealous. That's why they're there in the first place. They're willing to leave their families and homes and risk difficulty to go somewhere else. So if you're kind of not obeying the rules locally, like if you're a local community, they tend to be very harsh, right? So in Iraq, we had reports that they're breaking the fingers of people who smoke, for example, right? That they're causing lots of problems for communities at the local level and turning people against the groups. Even beyond that sort of kind of zealotry, think of how to phrase this. In many traditional societies, you have kind of a collective responsibility for your family. And what that means is if, you know, if I punch you and knock you over, it's perfectly reasonable for a member of your family to punch one of my family members and knock him over, right? That's a reasonable form of retaliation. And it keeps a lot of the local fighters in check. Because the local fighters know if they abuse someone in a village or town, someone might go after their family. And maybe it's not today, but that debt is going to be recorded, right? But the foreigners don't have that check, right? No one's going to be going, you know, I'm going to travel to Daphne, Alabama to threaten your family, right? That's not going to happen, right? So they tend to be used deliberately for a lot of brutality. So they cause a lot of the problems both because they're more zealous and because they're used for harder operations. I've spoken a lot, I'm not sure if I answered all your questions, so push me if I have stuff on this.
No, I think you covered everything. You talk about the people who are very excited, the ones who are overzealous getting over there, but not everybody self-selects initially. Mm-hmm. So what are the other kind of pull and push factors and propaganda that groups use to draw people out of Western countries into inhospitable areas that they are unfamiliar with?
So there are a lot of different themes they use. Right, and what I would stress is the themes go together. Right, so a big one is familiar, I think, to, you know, really kind of recruiting for fighting everywhere. Right, which is there's a horrible problem out there. Right, and they would say it is, you know, a host of things. Right, is the West has a war against Islam. And it manifests by things, whether it's the US invading Iraq, or Israel occupying Palestine, or Hindus taking territory from Muslims in Kashmir, whether it is the cartoons that mock the Prophet Muhammad. There's a long list. And some groups emphasize social concerns more, and some have emphasized kind of political and occupational ones. Al-Qaeda tended to be much more about the policy. The Islamic State is a bit more visceral. And they'll kind of have a host of these things to appeal to people. But the broader thing is, there's a problem out there, and there's a war going on. And what are you doing? Right? You are sitting on your couch, right? Do you want to stand up and be counted or not? So it's a call to action is a problem. Showing a problem, then having a call to action. And now, then they add a lot to that, right? So it's not just a call to action, but in the Islamic State's case, they would have said, and we're doing something about it, right? So a lot of their propaganda was imagery, right? It was tanks blowing up. It was troops being killed. It was saying, these are the oppressors. Guess who's fighting back? It's us, right? So you want to do something about it? We're a good group to do something about it because we're able to take the war to the enemy. And we're winning, right? See all these images? Shows that we're winning. So success was a big part of what made the Islamic State successful, right? And if you think about that just for joining an organization, right? Like, you know, I'm trying to think, bizarrely enough, I often use American politics as a metaphor for a lot of this, right? So think of the Democratic primary, right? Like, you know, what would be like the Hickenlooper message before he dropped out, right? Which is like, I'm barely registering in the polls, join my cause, right? Like, you have a lot of people who want to join a group that's winning, right? And that makes perfect sense because you feel as an individual, there may be opportunism, but also maybe these guys are making a difference, right? And that success often matters more than the particulars of the ideology they're promulgating. Keep going. They also said, we're winning so much, we've created a caliphate, right? And you have a religious obligation to join us, right? That there are all these rules that come with the caliphate. And that was the sort of thing when it first happens in Iraq, in middle of the kind of US occupation there. And Al-Qaeda, a lot of Islamic scholars are like, what? Caliphate? You gotta be kidding me, right? You can't even hold territory. But it became this incredibly exciting idea, right? And it was very compelling, and to the point where it surprised me, it surprised a lot of people, just how compelling it was, right? And then it became, do they have the right to declare a caliphate? And almost every Islamic scholar said nope. But it didn't matter, because they actually created one, right? And they were saying, you know, look, you care about establishing Islamic law? Come here. That's where it's happening, right? So a form of success that manifested not just in defeating enemies, but also in helping people live the good life according to their means. Then the next step, right? While you're here, you'll make a bunch of buddies, right? So a lot of their propaganda is about camaraderie, right? So there's a lot of singing, right? And it's actually kind of nice, right? It's the equivalent of guys sitting around the campfire bonding, right? And you know, any military organization knows a lot of what's selling is you're joining a community, right? You're not just doing something honorable, but you're doing something honorable as part of a community that has a lot of brotherhood and respect, right? And so they're selling that community, and it's something that aspect of Islamic State propaganda didn't get that much attention because it's not very dramatic, right? It's like, you know, this just in, Islamic State fighters sing, right? Like, you're not going to see that video, right? But that was a lot of what was watched. One of the things I often show when I do slides on this is a bunch of Islamic State fighters in a swimming pool, right? And they're trying to show, hey, like, we hang out and go swimming, right? It's not always this kind of, you know, very dramatic fight moment. It's a good moment as well. So I would think of it as problem, we're the solution, we're also offering a better alternative. And if you join us, you'll be part of this community. That is a band of brothers. And that combination is very effective. Some appeals to some people more, some to others less, but it combines very well.
Can you talk a little bit about the role that social media has played in this latest wave of jihadist foreign fighters, just because it wasn't a thing previously in previous phases?
One of my favorite topics. So if you go way back to the anti-Soviet struggle in Afghanistan, there are a lot of questions that the early volunteers have. And a lot of them are like, where's Afghanistan? Right? And like, hey, ask most Americans, there's a joke which is, Americans wage war so we can learn geography, right? But I think if you said, instead of Afghanistan, if you said Uzbekistan and asked how many Americans could find it on a map, probably a pretty small number, right? So we can laugh at this, but it's a pretty common problem. They had no idea where this was, right? And, ask this generation a question. If you could not look it up, how would you know? Right? What would you do, right? You'd have to go to the library, right? Or ask someone, right? And so they didn't know where it was. Okay, next question is, well, how do I get there? Right? There's not the kind of Riyadh-Kabul flight every day, right? So very basic questions of where's the fight, how do I find information about it, how do I get there, is really hard for them to find. And that's part of what Al-Qaeda does, is it starts to try to systematically answer those questions for each jihad. You want to show up in Bosnia, here's what you do, we can help you, we can recruit you, we can train you, we can help you travel. So it gets better and better, and as information flows happen, a lot more of that becomes bottom-up, right? Individuals, you can get that from the person next to you and find out who that person is rather than have to rely on propaganda or something coming down. Okay, social media, of course, as you all know, put all that on steroids. So the line people use who study this, they talk about many-to-many communication, right? So what was amazing about earlier waves like television or radio is all of a sudden I, Dan Byman, could talk to anyone who's going to listen. That could be millions of people if they all tuned in, right? And the ability of one person to talk to many was incredible. But with this way, many people can talk to many, right? Where if you think about it, if you all said, what you're going to do when you're done, read this book, right? You're going to go out and you're going to immediately on all your social media get it out there, right? And so, this group of people, of 30 or so people in this room, are communicating. You each have 1,000 friends and followers, right? You're right there. That's 30,000 people, right? And then you're so compelling in what you're saying that all your 1,000 people, they're all doing it, right? And it just goes boom, 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 boom. And the Islamic State itself, at its peak, put out thousands of pieces of propaganda a month in over a dozen languages. But it relied very heavily on a lot of locals to push that propaganda, to modify it, right? So let me put it this way. As a vice dean, I send out emails to our undergrads on a regular basis. And they have a common response. Click. Okay, they're done, right? They just ignore whatever I said, right? As I assume you do for many admin emails. That's a normal response. If your friend says, hey, I forwarded this email from Vice Dean Byman, check out blank, you might actually read it, right? And so what you can do is take general propaganda and customize it, right? You could say, okay, in this country we care more about sectarianism, right? Which wasn't so big in places like Europe, but was very big in the Muslim world, right? We care about sectarianism. In this country we care more about life under the caliphate. And they can highlight those parts, they can add their own additions. You could put it to music, right? You could do lots of things that often doesn't work, but at times catches on. So social media enabled massive communication. And it got to the point, the comparison I would make is, to be vaguely off color, is Islamic State propaganda for many Muslims became a bit like pornography, right? Which was, it wasn't as if it showed up automatically on your computer, right? But if you had the slightest inclination, there it was. Right, it was like super easy to find, right? It was not something, right? Like, I have teenage boys, right? And this sort of thing made it incredibly ubiquitous. And so in addition to the kind of propaganda value, it also enabled very rapid communication. So very basic questions, how do I get to the war zone? Okay, well, here's what you do. Buy this ticket, but remember to pay in cash. Remember to max out all your credit cards before you go. Oh, thank you very much. What else should I do? Well, you might want to sell some stuff. By the way, we could all use some warm clothes or some night vision goggles. So anything you can grab would be great. So there's a lot of back and forth for instructions. And then you start to formalize this, right? There are guides like how to survive in the West, what to pack for jihad, right? Those sorts of things. And you pass those around. And, okay, when you get to the airport, look for this guy. right? And so there's a lot of facilitation going on. So the logistics become much easier. It's easy to get money, right? There's a huge problem jihadists have with money, which is what any organization has with money, is people steal, right? So, you know, you give $10,000 to a courier, $9,000 happen to show up, right? That's just a constant problem. That's why a lot of organizations hate to deal with cash, right? You don't have to deal with cash, right? So huge advantages. And in 2013, 2014, the social media companies are actually making it worse. I don't know how many of you have ever looked at kind of the studies of algorithms of social media companies, right? But their goal is to keep you on the site, right? Because then they could shove more ads in front of you, right? So the longer you're engaged, the better, right? So, you know, example I used to use, I think they changed it, but with YouTube, they play on what we call kind of, you know, a sort of, excuse me, attempts at confirmation bias. So if you type in, "Are vaccines safe?" you get a very different response than if you type in, "Are vaccines unsafe?" when it's logically the same question, right? But unsafe, you're a little nervous, right? You're kind of saying, I'm not so sure. I wonder if they're unsafe or not, right? So you're much more likely to get videos that are conspiracy theories, right? Because they'll keep you on the site, right? And they tend to go kind of one level beyond where you are. So if you're like interested in a vegetarian diet, you'll get vegan stuff, right? Yeah, okay. And that is the equivalent in culinary terms of Hezbollah. It will make you more extreme in general, is how they did. And on Twitter, I used to follow some foreign fighters, and it was very helpful because they would suggest other ones, right? Like just like if you follow, you know, if you follow rock stars or poets or whatever it is, you get more rock stars and poets, right? You got more foreign fighters, right? Because that's what the algorithm does, right? And that's 9 times out of 10, that's great, right? But that's what they were doing. So the social media company's initial response was, we can't do much about this, right? And they're like, you know, it's not against the law, they're free speech, can't do much about this. This was really led by a terrorism analyst named J.M. Berger, who I give a lot of credit to on this, which was, he really did this almost single-minded effort for several years to say, if you look at your own terms of service, you can throw them off tomorrow, right? And I'm sure all of you have, you know, every month looked at the updated terms of service on the social media site you're on, right? But it basically says, blah, 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 we'll kick you off whenever we want, right? It's pretty broad. And as private companies, they have that right? They can do a lot of this. So, especially after the Paris attacks, they began to suddenly discover that these people had violated the terms of service, right? And began to go after them much more aggressively, to the point where I actually think, you know, not perfect, but a lot of these people are very effectively contained on social media, right? And you can always start a new account, right? But the problem is, you know, if Dan Byman has 1,000 followers, and he's thrown off, and he goes back on as Dan B, and he's doing the same stuff, I might get 100, and then they'll figure it out, and they'll throw me off, and then I might go down to 10, right? So repeatedly throwing people off had a huge and negative impact on these individuals. Even more, it became an intelligence tool, right? So there was a recent START report from the University of Maryland that said, if you're engaged in social media, you're more likely to be caught by law enforcement than if you're not, if you're a radical, right? And kind of the obvious reason, to go back to why you joined, right? Almost all these people, remember we're talking foreign fighters here, and the term I hate, just to give you my pet peeve, is foreign terrorist fighter. Because the vast majority of these people don't intend to be terrorists. Some do, but the overwhelming majority don't see themselves that way and don't go to the terrorism route. And if you're becoming a foreign fighter, from your point of view, you're joining the Marines, right? And I will, not being a Marine myself, I will caricature the Marines with apologies to those in the room. But if you're 18 years old and you join the Marines, what do you want to do? You want to kind of tell all your buddies, right? It's kind of cool, right? You want the girls to know that you just happen to join the Marines and you're going to be a killing machine, right? Just fun to know that, right? And so, of course, when you are becoming a badass foreign fighter, you want people to know. And remember, you're only talking to the 50 or 100 people in your utterly impenetrable secret world of Twitter or Facebook, right? So you have tons of people who tweet about, you know, so excited to have joined the Islamic State, off to fight. Here's my Islamic State tattoo. Did you get a lot, which Islamic State itself hates tattoos, but put that aside. There are people whose likes on Facebook are jihad, right? These aren't the brightest bulbs, right? And in general, they think they're heroes. So they're not trying to hide what they do. So they're much easier to catch. And then once you catch them, they put themselves into link analysis software, right? So if any of you have ever used like Palantir software or anything like that, that's basically what Twitter and Facebook do, right? Is they're trying to show, that I have a connection to Sam, and Sam has a connection to someone here, and someone here has a connection to this. You can trace all that. But gee, is it more likely that the friends of a jihadist themselves might be jihadists? We're checking out, right? And so there's a lot of information given off social media. Increasingly, they've been driven to encrypted platforms. That's much harder from a law enforcement point of view, but it's also much harder from a propaganda point of view, right? Let me ask, actually I might get a strange answer in this room, but I'll just ask nonetheless, how many of you use Facebook? How many of you use Telegram? Okay, that's actually significantly more as a percentage of the general population, right? And far fewer of you use it, right? So you have to use Telegram to recruit. Right there, you shrink your recruiting pool tremendously, right? So you can do a lot in terms of communication with encrypted platforms, but not everything. And a lot of them, just to editorialize further, a lot of them kind of suck, right? Like there's a reason, like Twitter is surprisingly seamless, right? Like they do kind of an amazing job. And there are alternatives, but they're not nearly as good. There's a reason people use Twitter, right? So when you force people off the main platforms, you have huge problems for those people.
I think social media makes the jihad in Iraq and Syria very unique. The other kind of aspect that we've seen develop over the last 5 to 10 years is the sectarian nature of the conflict. I'm curious, and you pointed out you hate the FTF, the foreign terrorist fighters, since a lot of these groups a lot of these fighters are going over to join militias or insurgent groups as they see it, not necessarily terrorist groups. Is there a difference between the people who are going to join Hezbollah versus people who are going to join Jabhat al-Nusra or ISIS in these battle spaces?
So in Syria, we saw over 20,000 non-Syrian Shia Muslims go to join the fight. Right? And the Lebanese Hezbollah kind of went as its own organization. And also you had significant numbers of Afghans in particular, also Pakistanis and Iraqis. And it was a very different dynamic for a couple of reasons. First of all, sectarianism, as Sam points out, was a big motivation, right, which was happening on both sides. And that became a reinforcing cycle, right? So a bunch of angry Sunnis show up for sectarianism, it proves to the Shia that the other side is really sectarianism, and they start to go, and vice versa. With Hezbollah, it really initially tried to avoid the Syrian war. So it lays its head down, it says, well, it's too bad, and we're trying to stay out of it. It is in part because a lot of people in the Muslim world saw the Syrian regime as the bad guy. And Hezbollah would always say, as would Iran, we're not a Shia organization, and Iran would say we're not a Shia revolution. We're a Muslim revolution, right? And therefore, we're not about this sectarianism, right? And it seemed like a genuine popular revolt, and they were very nervous on being on the wrong side of it. But the Iranians were very close to the Syrian regime, and the Iranians called in their favors. And so Hezbollah initially began to go very discreetly, and saying, we may have a few people as kind of observers, but not playing a big role. And then the funeral started to become pretty clear to everyone in Lebanon, so then they just embraced it. And they went, and Hezbollah to me was really a game changer early in the Syrian civil war. There's a big question of could the Syrian regime have lost? And Hezbollah at a few key moments played a huge reinforcing role in some key battles. And they were much better fighters than the Syrian military. They were much more dedicated, they were much more trained. They had fought against the Israelis for years, so they fought against a very good foe. And so they were very impressive in their own right. Also coming in were a lot of Iraqi groups that had kind of been blooded during the Iraqi civil war especially, but also against US forces. So again, pretty skilled group of fighters coming in. The Afghans and Pakistanis were much less skilled. They were often people, especially on the Afghan side, who were Afghans who were refugees in Iran, who were getting citizenship rights, who were getting benefits from the Iranian government. Many were more in the mercenary category where they're getting a lot of benefits for going over. But a big difference for them was they would be formally trained. The Iranians would actually train them as you would a military force. And I will stress this as a huge point, which is when most of the foreigners come in to join the Islamic State or other groups, they're often a force for division. When the groups are fighting on the side of the Syrian regime, they're entering an integrated command and control structure. So the regime is much better able to use them effectively. They're not coming in groups of 5 or 6. The flow is very organized. They're under the control of the Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. And they're able to be used in a highly effective way. And there's a big question, which at least I don't know the answer to, which is what's going to happen to all these guys now that the war is winding down, right? And Hezbollah is Hezbollah, and that's its own conversation. But a big shift is all these Afghans and Pakistanis who are much better fighters now. So is it they're more loyal to Iran? We'll see kind of an Iranian Foreign Legion show up in places like Yemen, right? Is it when Sunni militants try to push the Shia around Afghanistan, it's a different Shia community, right? These guys can fight back. Will it be a much more aggressive Shia community, right? Because they believe they can fight better, they have the Iranians behind them. I don't know. But you have a much greater capacity than you had 5 years ago among these groups.
Kind of took my next question, which is talking about what we do with the 10,000 to 20,000 people who are now in camps across Iraq and Syria. Obviously, there are a lot of conversations about repatriation. There was a report the other day, I think in the Times, talking about even the camps for just women and children, where Sharia law is being enforced brutally and violently against fellow women and children in the camps. So what do we do with these guys?
So I have pretty strong views, right? Which is I'm a huge fan of repatriation. I think every government should be responsible for its citizens, right? And if your laws are not robust enough to deal with that problem, you need to change your laws, right? So the Europeans were very critical of the U.S. position on Guantanamo Bay, which was there are some people who are super dangerous, yet our legal system can't handle them, so we're going to create a place to hold them, right? The Europeans are effectively doing that in Iraq and Syria, right? Where they're saying, this is so dangerous we can't handle it. So we're just going to have our people held here, and we're not going to deal with it, right? And, I'm not trying to say Guantanamo is a picnic, right? But I'd much rather be in Guantanamo than in a detention facility in Iraq and Syria, right? There's no comparison, right? And to me, it's a real abrogation of their responsibilities as states. And now, in the European sense, I always kind of hate to use the word Europe because there's so much variation within Europe. There's tremendous variation on what to do with bugs, right? So I mentioned the French tried to kill their own people, right? They deployed special forces out there whose primary purpose was to hunt down French nationals and kill them. Also, fighting the Islamic State would be a big bonus, but like when you can hit the Islamic State, it'd be great. Russia did a fascinating policy before the Sochi Olympics especially, but in general kind of had a gate open one way and tried to have all their militants head over there. And then when they were there, tried to bomb them all. Seems to work for them, right? So very different approaches. The Germans are trying to get their people back, right? So there's a general question. European laws are often varied on how much you can actually convict someone for doing this. Right, so the U.S. has a material support law where simply joining a terrorist group is giving your services to an illegal organization, and that can put you in jail for 20 years. Right? In Europe, they don't have, it varies again, but most countries don't have the equivalent. So you actually have to do something. Right? And proving you did something is really hard. Right? So the joke in kind of counterterrorism circles is, the Islamic State must have had awesome food, because everyone who went there to volunteer turned out to be a cook, right? And that's the line, right? I was just a cook, right? I was doing it. And occasionally going back to social media, we're like, yeah, but on your Facebook feed, right, you brag about killing people, right? But then they're even like, well, I lied, right? I was trying to impress my buddies and I lied, which happens, right? So the level of proof different court systems require varies. Also, a long jail sentence for many of these people in Europe is 5 years, right? And 3 years, 2 years is very common. And since Europe has a much bigger prison radicalization problem than the United States does, you kind of combine prison radicalization with short sentences. And in the US system, the kind of assumption is, they're probably up to no good and they're 25 now. When they get out, they'll be 45, so they'll be, kind of decrepit and won't be able to do anything, right? And the European system, that assumption doesn't hold, right? And jihad tends to be a young person's game, and prison in Europe doesn't have the same effect on that kind of basic demographics. All that said, I still believe it's the responsibility of states to deal with their own citizens. I'm very uncomfortable with outsourcing basic questions of justice. And in Iraq, that's tended to be you just shoot them. In Syria, the Kurdish forces have been more likely to detain people, but to go to your point, Sam, it's a huge one. It's very manpower intensive to police detention camps or refugee camps. Right? You need a lot of intelligence, you need a lot of forces on the ground. And the way you avoid that, like this happens in US prisons, the way you avoid that manpower commitment is you just turn it over to the inmates. Right? And if there's an organized group within, you kind of cut deals with them. Right? You won't do X, Y, and Z, and in exchange we'll give you free reign. And so the fact that the Islamic State is there and well organized makes perfect sense. For those of you who are kind of into the minutiae of government reports, right? A lot of the Inspector General reports on Afghanistan say, oh, by the way, the prisons in Afghanistan are run by the Taliban. Right? And these are under authority of the Afghan government working with the United States, right? So that's Afghanistan, which is, much better resourced in many ways than the Syrian Kurds. So it's a hard problem, and I don't think we're helping them much. But one of the numbers I cite in my book is, the Australians say that to follow a terrorist suspect for a year with comprehensive surveillance is about $7 million per suspect. Right? So, if you have 500 people in France you have to follow, it's a big number. Right? And the United States has an advantage, which has a relatively small number of people who have done this, and very large security services. Right? And many countries have the opposite. And so it's a real challenge for them, and I don't want to minimize it. But instinctively, I go to this repatriation, and especially the women are a question mark, right? Some women fall in the camp of, I'm loyal to my husband and he dragged me over there. But a lot fall into the camp of, I was really excited and actually participated. But there is a kind of gendering of all this, where the women are seen more as innocent. The children, to me, though, are clearly innocent. Right? And I'm very uncomfortable. There's no real proof that they were a son of a jihadist, that therefore they will grow up to be a jihadist, right? We don't really believe that about anything else, right? We wouldn't say the 10-year-old, his father was a murderer, so let's just throw him in jail now, let's get him died, right? We don't think that, right? In fact, at least I hope we think the opposite, which is, oh my God, his father was a criminal, we need to give him a lot of extra love and services, because otherwise that kid's going to have a more difficult road, and we need to put more investment in there. Unfortunately, we're not really good.
Kind of along those lines, we talk about what we should or shouldn't do with the ones who are already over there. Can you talk a little bit about how effective counterterrorism measures that we've had preventing people from going abroad, does that in turn then increase the risk of homegrown attacks here? People who, they reached out to a facilitator and they said, no, it's too hard for you to get into Syria, the border's closed to Turkey, just stay where you are and do something where you live.
So we see a shift in the Islamic State in particular, starting around 2016, where they start to say, don't come here. Right? And it's in part because of counterterrorism success. Right? So people are being killed right and left in Caliphate itself, but also transit becomes very difficult. So leaving your country becomes much harder. The Turks finally cracked down on their border and actually are stopping people from going across. So there's a huge shift in the ability of people to go. And they're like, you can actually do a lot more good for us if you stay home. And so we do see a spike, right? And there's no doubt in my mind that Al-Qaeda in the past or the Islamic State would rather have their people come to their haven, train them, and then either deploy them as a military force or use them as a terrorist threat. But when you can't do that, then you're into the kind of inspirational, homegrown violent extremism sort of effort. And we have seen an increase, right? And certainly an increase in attempts and at times an increase in success. And a fair number of those people in my mind would have been foreign fighters if they had that chance, right? That was kind of a way of glory. They felt they had an obligation. And now they're like, well, I can't do that, but at least I can do this. The hope is that that's a lag effect, that, that was something that was a problem in 2016 and 2017 as people couldn't become foreign fighters, but now it's 2019. And the kind of memory of all these people being foreign fighters has diminished a bit. And we have seen decreases in attempts, so there is some hope for that, but it's still a question.
So counterterrorism efforts to prevent people from going are working. What else is the US government or Europe doing that's right, and maybe what do they need to work on a little bit when it comes to the foreign fighter problem set?
So the social media monitoring, the working with communities to identify people, cutting off travel, these are very big successes, right? And also better efforts to share information, to identify people who are going from country to country and when they return, right? It's always still striking to me that someone might be on a watch list in Germany and the Italians are like, oh, we have no idea who this person is, right? And that still happens on a regular basis, and again, progress has been made. So I would say a couple things to think about for doing better, right? A very difficult one is this broader question of how do we think about reintegration, right? What do we do when people come back? And related to that is the idea of an off-ramp, right? So what I tend to think about is, many of you are young, so I won't say kid, but let's say your little brother or sister, right, is thinking about joining a jihadist group, right? And you're afraid that if you call the police, your kid brother or sister is going to be in jail. And you don't want them in jail, right? But you don't want them to go to Syria, right? So those are kind of lousy options, right? But wouldn't it be nice if you could call the police and they say, we have a program, which is, well, kind of try to take them out of this brawl, right? And my ideal in my mind would be some combination of someone's uncle, a soccer coach, and a religious leader, right? As some form of local intervention. And there are different community efforts to do this. It requires a few things. It requires the program to exist, right, which it doesn't in many places. It requires prosecutors to say we're not going to go for a terrorism prosecution, which is kind of splashy, and instead recognize this is a stupid 18-year-old kid and treat him that way rather than as a potential terrorist, right? But also you will be wrong from time to time, right? You will think it's working, and then it won't, right? And that's politically really dangerous, right? So it's easy for me to say I think this is worth doing. But there is that, whatever the number is, that where this happens, where someone doesn't respond, and then you're like, you knew this guy was dangerous, you didn't do anything about it, right? You put him in this cushy program and you let him kill people, right? That is understandably politically raging, even though I would say, yeah, but you know what, he might have gone to Syria instead. We might not have known about them instead. They might have done an attack instead. It's kind of very hard to do this. So these programs are politically hard to sustain, but I think having off-ramps before people go and then when they come back is important. Related to that are programs for when people are in jail when they get out of jail, right? The prison radicalization and post-prison problems to me are big ones. How do you deal with those? That's especially a problem, as I was discussing earlier, in Europe, where their numbers are just much bigger and the people are much younger and the prison radicalization is a much bigger problem. With the Islamic State, a lot of European countries were caught by surprise, and that's surprising, right? Because they had problems on and off for the last 20 years. And so it's not that necessarily a conflict will break out on the scale of Syria that will inspire as many people in the next 5 years, but it might, right? It's very hard to know. So I would think about institutionalizing a lot of what's been learned and what's been done rather than kind of jumping on to the next danger. So those are a few things that does it.
Again, not stole my thunder, but you're one step ahead of me. What happens next? Is this kind of a lull now that the caliphate's collapsed, or is this just kind of, a timeout until, the next conflict inspires another, 10 to 20,000 people to leave their homes?
So there almost certainly will be another conflict that will attract foreign fighters, right? So there's a lot of instability in the Muslim world. That just makes civil wars more likely to break out. However, a lot of civil wars don't attract significant numbers of foreign fighters. Right? So Mali didn't attract large numbers of foreign fighters. The Algerian Civil War didn't attract large numbers of foreign fighters. And even putting that aside, a lot of the foreign fighter-linked conflicts don't lead to a lot of terrorism. So I began this book project really in a way to fix a mistake I made over 10 years ago. So when the US invades Iraq, and it goes south very quickly, I was tremendously concerned that Iraq would be Afghanistan on steroids. Right? It seemed like a much bigger conflict in terms of capturing popular imagination in the Muslim world than Afghanistan had ever been. It was actually about the United States. So if Afghanistan produced anti-American violence, and it was really, the US had nothing to do with Afghanistan for the most part. I mean, we played a role in supporting rebels, but that was it. This one was actually us, right? We were invading and occupying a big Muslim country, right? And I thought, boy, this is going to cause huge problems. And there's arguably zero international terrorism. If you take regional stuff out, you take Jordan attacks, for example, but I'm talking about attacks in Europe and the United States. Arguably zero foreign fighter-linked attacks from Iraq in 2003. And that period of the Iraq War, that kind of 5 years. And so I was wrong on that, right? I thought there'd be a big problem, there wasn't. And so the interesting question then becomes which conflicts produce foreign fighters that lead to international terrorism, which don't. And we still don't have great answers to that. But to me, it's quite plausible another conflict would break out that won't attract foreign fighters, or that if it does, it won't necessarily lead to an international terrorist group there using it as a base of operations. And Syria was pretty unusual for one reason, right? Which was there's a jihadi strategy document going back a decade, or not quite a decade, almost a decade before the Syrian Civil War, right? And they're saying, if you look at this, our problem, which is whenever we show up somewhere to fight and we start to get strong, the United States shows up on their side and presses its thumb on the scale and we lose. So is there some place we could fight and establish our state and do our thing where America wouldn't show up? Right? And we're like, how about Syria? Right? Because the United States doesn't like the Assad regime. Right? Of those of you who remember in 2013 and 2014, when we're talking about U.S. intervention, we're talking about U.S. intervention against Assad. We're not talking about U.S. intervention against the jihadists. Right? So they were able to enjoy a significant period of time where they were building their strength without countervailing forces. And once the countervailing forces set in 2014, it's a pretty steady progress to shrink the caliphate. Right? There are ups and downs, there are problems. I don't want to make this sound easy, but it was pretty steady. And so I'm not sure how replicable the Syrian conflict is. But that said, there certainly could be other ones that on a smaller scale are inspiring, but I'd be surprised if there was something on that mass scale. But I've been surprised before.
I want to open it up now to anybody in the audience if you have any questions.
Hi, Jess Rogers, second year SP. So you were saying before that many, or actually most of the people going into a fight don't really view themselves as terrorists, but rather fighters. Mm-hmm. So we were talking about repatriation. If they do come back to their own country and they don't really successfully get prosecuted, or they're only in prison for a few years, and then they're out in society again, what do you see as the biggest risk? Regrouping and reorganizing within their home country, or committing terrorist attacks now that they've spent a lot of time with the terrorist group and are more convinced of the ideology?
Let me throw a few numbers at you. Okay, so before the Syrian Civil War, there was a very good study on this question of how many people who become foreign fighters become terrorists. Mm-hmm. And the answer was about 1 in 9 end up hooking up with the terrorist group. That's actually a very large number. Okay, and with the Syrian Civil War and such huge numbers, the answer actually became more like 1 in 300, right? Where so few of the people involved in Syria had links to international terrorism, right? They mean they were part of the Islamic State, right? They were part of a bad group, but they weren't doing terrorism, if you want to define that as a separate phenomenon than joining a group like the Islamic State. So in general, the terrorism risk is relatively limited, but real, right? And when you say, 1 in a couple hundred with thousands of people involved, that's still a reasonable number, right? We haven't seen much in the way of what people call sleeper cell activity. So the idea that you would go to a country, kind of burrow in, American style, kind of live your life, and then reach out to the terrorist group, or they reach out to you and say, okay, now that you look like, ma and pa in the town, we're going to activate you, right? They seem to act relatively quickly when they return from abroad. What tends to happen, though, I think the biggest danger when they leave jail is they serve as facilitators, right? Where they have a Rolodex and they have credibility. So when they show up at a community center or with young people, they're able to both answer, they're able to inspire, and they're able to connect. And that to me is a very dangerous function. So having a few that are part of a logistical network is to me a very dangerous thing. And that's something that's typically much harder to prosecute, especially in Europe, right? Because it's rare that they'll say, we want you to go to Yemen to learn to kill a bunch of people, right? You seem very committed to the cause in general. There's advanced study available in Yemen, right? And then you go to Yemen, and then the next step, the much more violent step, really commences. And there's a lot of, we've been showing you jihadi films, and you seem very excited about them, but that's legal, right? So that's where I think the biggest danger is. But it would not be terribly surprising to me if a few of the people released end up doing some very nasty things, whether that's simply running people down with cars, shooting people with guns, blowing stuff up. I could certainly imagine a more direct operational role.
Thank you.
So my name's Jay, I'm a first year student here. Out of the group that does go on to join a terrorist organization, is there any way to kind of identify which group's likely to do that before they actually join a terrorist organization and carry out an attack?
So, I'm sorry, identify which terrorist groups are likely.
Or
which groups are
identify
likely
which foreign fighters are more likely to join a terrorist group based on what kind of jobs they wind up doing, or?
Not really. They tend to be much more random than we expect. It very much depends on who the logistical network is, right? So a lot of people, if you kind of think of the 20-year-old who's like, I want to join the fight, these kind of nuances of Jabhat al-Nusra versus the Islamic State, they're not too plugged into. And it's more the facilitator who says, okay, I have connections to this particular group, you're going there, right? And we see that kind of phenomena show up again and again, not just in the jihadist world, but in the non-jihadist world. For those of you interested in one of the great memoirs of the Spanish Civil War is George Orwell's memoir. And he ends up fighting for a Trotskyite group, which is the key to his whole anti-communist career, right? Because they're purged and everything, but it's because they were the ones who were recruiting when he shows up, right? It wasn't I really care about this, more okay, I want to go fight. Oh, you guys are going to go fight? Great, let's go, right? It's not much more than that. And he's a much more sophisticated person, even at 20, whatever he was, than most of these jihadis. So I think it's less the profile of the group and much more the nature of the facilitation network.
Yakubu's Palazzi, second semester. To what extent are members of the Islamic State fleeing Iraq and Syria to join an Islamic State affiliate or province elsewhere? And have you seen evidence of the Islamic State facilitating that travel? In other words, was there a strategy to relocate members, not necessarily back home or to a general region, but specifically to an affiliate or province?
So when the Islamic State was at its peak, it was sending some of its people to different places. Right? And sometimes these were, it had recruited a bunch of Libyans, so it was sending them back to Libya to kind of strengthen its brand there. But Libya and Egypt were two of the big places. And we do see people show up here and there. It is also said, if you can't come to the caliphate, try to go to one of the mini caliphates, right? So can't make it here, go to one of the other good places, and then if you can't do that, strike it home, right? So it has kind of a tiered relationship. Since they've been really near the kind of edge of defeat and then defeated in the last year and a half, they haven't really been able to do the kind of travel facilitation on a large scale. So I'm sure there are individuals who are going here and there. But the kind of mass transfer is much harder just because it'll be detected. And it's, to bribe your way through Turkey can be very expensive. There's a lot of people looking for these people. The host governments are looking for these people. And the joy of air travel especially is it enables a finite number of places to check, right? So even if you can smuggle across the border, it's much harder to get to another place. So it's harder to, it was easy for bin Laden to relocate from Sudan to Afghanistan because no one was stopping him. Right? He just got on a plane, right? But once people try to actually stop these guys from relocating, the transit itself becomes very vulnerable. So at least what I've seen, and there may be others in the room who have seen information I haven't seen kind of a mass kind of movement of people from the core to a province or from one province to another.
So you mentioned that a lot of the fighters were really unskilled. I know some of the from other places like the Chechens, they actually did play an important role in the battlefield. Overall, based on how much resources they had to put to get these fighters there and their relative inexperience, what do you think the net effect of the foreign fighters for ISIS was in terms of gaining ground?
Good question. So, and you raise an important point I should have raised in my own remarks, right? So many are incompetent, fair number are not, right? And that number can have a disproportionate impact in some civil wars because, especially early on, a lot of people don't know how to fight. So having someone who's been a veteran of 3 civil wars in the past say, okay, here's how you take a fortified position, right? That's a good skill to learn, right? Having people who can give you kind of basic instruction really can change things. And the foreign fighters often play that role. And you mentioned the Chechens, they often play that role. And the Chechens in a Syria context are really kind of people from the Caucasus. So a lot of the Chechens were not Chechens by narrow definitions, but kind of from that area. So they would often have a big impact on kind of initial military capacity. In Syria, they often also provide, they were often used as shock troops because they're willing to sacrifice themselves, right? So they're the first through the gate. With that, at times goes suicide bombing. And this caused some problems in some places, like in Iraq. It actually caused some foreign fighters to leave because they weren't being used, right? Or they weren't being used in a cool enough way. So it would be like, we want you to be a suicide bomber, but could you blow up that policeman? And they're like, no, I want to do something that's going to be like on YouTube, right? I want to be something that's really awesome. And so there are expectations, but in general, they were able to use them for high cost operations pretty effectively. And also, to your point, which is an important one, a certain percentage of them were highly skilled, and that increased the military capacity of the opposition side considerably.
In relation to the off-ramp as people come home, has there been, and is it possible to do analysis of basically click-through rates on who's responding to which types of jihadist propaganda and literature and how that impacts them coming home? The impetus for that question being the statistic about the percentage of people within the Muslim population in Europe joining in this foreign fighter movement compared to others. And to me, it's, if you see populism rising in Europe and it's all white nationalist based, those two things are linked. Is anyone doing analysis on that? Is that even possible?
So I definitely think it's possible, right? I mean, you'll end up in correlation land, and you'll end up with questions like, are the people clicking through, were they already likely to join in the first place, right? So it's a variant of the, did Russia flip the election to Trump, right? Is it, okay, I wasn't going to vote for Trump, and then I saw the Russian video, and now I am, or is it, I was going to vote for Trump, and that Russian video confirmed my opinion, right? It's very hard to disentangle those two. But actually, social media companies have a huge capacity to do this research, right? This is a very kind of they do it all the time, right? You are constantly being experimented on by Facebook and Twitter and other social media companies, right? They're running tons and tons of micro experiments, right? So just to kind of take this back a step, does anyone have a Capital One card? Right? Like Capital One's, their growth rate went like this, right? While every other company's growth rate was like that. right? It was because they were running constant micro experiments on like, should we put the interest rate on the outside of the envelope or the inside of the envelope? What color should we run? Right? Should it be limited time or not? Right? They're just always running side-by-side comparison, making themselves better and better and better. Big data enables you to put that on steroids, right? And the social media companies should be able to kind of do fairly sophisticated assessments of who's clicking on what and what those outcomes are. It would require a lot of cooperation with government. And that is a problem for them politically, because a lot of them don't want to be seen as, we're going to look at what you click through and then pass it to government. Right? But so it's certainly feasible. I think the harder thing is actually politically feasible than technically feasible.
Hello, my name is Morgan Moon. I'm first year. You were talking about jihadist wives and women on their reintegration back to the country. A lot of them are kind of getting away more innocently or being able to reintegrate faster. Do you see a possibility in the rise of them having leadership roles in terms of recruitment and radicalization within their areas?
So the question is, will the returnees have leadership roles?
Specifically the women, since they are being able to reintegrate quicker and more innocently than having to go, they're able to reintegrate quicker into society?
So there's certainly the potential, right? Now again, what made the caliphate a little different was women could play a role without fighting, right? And that's harder in most of these struggles because there isn't kind of a large defined territory. Most of it's about fighting in most of the other struggles, so it's definitely harder for women to play a leadership role in most of the traditional conflicts. We have seen women play very effective roles as recruiters, right? And that's especially easy in a social media context because it involves shame, right? So I don't know how many of you know, like in World War I, a lot of the militaries were still volunteer militaries, right? But if you were a young man who did not volunteer, you were a coward. Right, so that question of, it's volunteer military, but there's a huge social shame, right? So there would be women who would go around with, I forgot, there was white flowers.
White feathers.
White feather, thank you. With white feathers, right, and give them to young men who were not in uniform, right, to suggest they were cowards, right? And that's extremely potent, right, in terms of kind of social shaming and social recruiting. And we've seen jihadist variants of that, right? Like, you guys are just talking crap about how you want to do stuff when the real men are over there fighting, right? And so I think I would focus on the propagandist role as the most likely. But your question to me highlights a big one, which is a lot of it's going to depend on where there's space for them to operate, right? So if the law is very much focused on operations, less focused on recruitment, there'll be more recruitment room. If there's an opportunity for them to play more direct leadership roles in combat organizations, right, which is currently very unlikely, but who knows, right? You could imagine shifts. So there's kind of an opportunity structure for everyone involved, and for women it's traditionally much more constrained, but it's still a structure where that may shift.
My name is Paul. I'm a second-year student. Thank you for giving this talk, Dr. Byman, but I was going to ask you, is there any, you kind of mentioned that with the Syrian war and everything that's happened there, it's been a big issue more for Europe as a percentage than like America. We haven't had as many foreign fighters go there, or Americans go there. Is there any future conflict or any specific location where you could see Americans being one of the top groups of individuals to travel and become foreign fighters? Or is there something about Americans where we're less likely to be foreign fighters? Or I'm just curious as
I think there's something less likely about American Muslims that make them less likely to be foreign fighters, right? So there are a few things, right? One is, first of all, it's simply much harder, right? I mentioned there's kind of a large law enforcement presence that's much more aggressive. And you have to, unless the fight is in Canada or Mexico, right? You have to get on an airplane, right? And that's, again, just a finite number of places to look at, right? The problem for Europe with the Syrian civil war was you could take a bus, right? You could take a bus to Turkey from any European country, right? And so you have to worry about a lot more forms of transportation. So logistically it's harder. Because there have been fewer foreign fighters in the past, you don't have the network effects. So you don't have the, okay, in our community we know people have gone and we respect them, and now it's your turn, right? It's like, oh, I don't really know anyone who's done this, right? And so in Europe, that's been a big problem, is the first 100 seeded the next 1,000, and now people worry with the Islamic State that there'll just be a large number of people, and they'll be an example for the next generation. That number is much smaller in the United States. The American Muslim population is much less concentrated. So there's not like a hotspot. There aren't like, there are plenty of Muslims in the Washington, D.C. area, right? But there's, to my knowledge at least, no like, oh, that's the Muslim neighborhood or the Muslim area, the way you would say in a European city, right? So you have fewer networks there. But a big one is the American Muslim population is extremely well integrated. Right, so I'll have to check my stats, but I still think this is true. The average American Muslim is wealthier and better educated than the average non-Muslim. Right? So, the system's working reasonably well, right? It's certainly not perfect. In addition, the community has cooperated extensively with law enforcement. So you are dealing with your own community when you're trying to do violence, right? You're going against your own community, so that reduces the benefit of it, right? You're not like a hero. But also they're much more likely to turn you in. So Omar Mateen, who did the Post nightclub bombing, Muslims in Florida called the FBI and said there's something wrong with this guy, right? And the FBI tries to intervene. They didn't find probable cause to do anything. But it wasn't the community's fault, right? The community was like, there's a problem, do something, right? And that's a huge barrier. So to me, there are big differences in the American case. Both on the kind of resourcing enforcement side, but also on the community side that make this harder. So you tend to get individuals or very small groups rather than broader networks.
Sir, Mark Solomons, SSP, Force Planner at the Pentagon. Practical application here as far as your assessment of these foreign fighters in the next 30 years. Do you see this as a problem or a crisis? Problem that could be a crisis and not addressed. I'm just wondering, you hear a lot about the youth bulge and, it could get worse if not handled properly, but for, the U.S. and defense, if, you're allocating money towards foreign fighters, are we at the right spot now? Do we need more? Can we cut back?
It's always, no one who ever deals with problems wants to say you should cut back. But I will certainly say you should not increase it, right? The way I usually describe the foreign fighter problem is it's an incredibly dangerous problem that's very amenable to policy intervention, right? So if you don't do anything, you get Afghanistan in the 1990s, where you have thousands of these people being trained for dangerous terrorist operations, and then years later, they're still blowing stuff up, right? It's like a really bad problem. But in my book, I talk a lot about how you're able to kind of stop them from going in the first place. You can stop them in transit. You can kill them or disrupt them in the war zone. You can stop them on return. That once you start to focus on this problem, becoming a foreign fighter is actually an intelligence negative, right? In the 1990s, when someone went to Afghanistan, you're like, we lost them. Maybe they'll pop up, right? Maybe they'll come back on the radar screen, but, for the next month or year or whatever, we don't know where they are, right? And maybe they'll come back with false documents and we'll have no idea. Now we are much more likely to be like, hey, this person's gone from their community. We know there's a problem, right? Oh, we've identified them as a war zone and they're coming back. Who are they talking to, right? So the intelligence picture is dramatically better. And it's much easier and more effective to disrupt them. So I would say that the current resource level, especially from a US point of view, is very good. The problem has diminished in recent years as the Islamic State has been hurt, right? There are a million op-eds that kind of begin with, although the caliphate is gone, comma, well, ... right? The caliphate being gone is a really big deal. Right? That's a huge blow. Now, that doesn't mean the Islamic State disappears. It doesn't mean terrorism goes away, right? I don't want to kind of go to the other extreme. But it is a success. And so I would still want to be vigilant. I'd still want to resource this thing. But I think extremely high-level resources is probably not necessary.
All right, if that's, we have time for one more question. So now that the caliphate's basically gone, a lot of people in op-eds have been suspecting that there will be more terrorist attacks within their home countries. Why has that not happened? Do we know what we're doing by now, or?
So, what I would say is, how many Americans died on U.S. soil in 2018 from jihadist terrorism, right? One, right? And it was a couple kids were at a sleepover. One was looking at jihadist propaganda, another made fun of him, and the guy killed him, right? So if this is like the big ISIS terror threat, like we're okay, right? Now the problem with terrorism, right, is it's not like, you know, it goes from 1 to 2 to 1 to 3, right? It goes from 1 to 50 and down, right? So it's not a neat progression of numbers. But all that said, you know, the post 9/11 era has had slightly over 100 Americans who have died on US soil from jihadist terrorism, right? And that's, you know, 104 too many, right? I don't want to minimize that number. But it's far less than people feared, right? If you kind of go back, for those of you who remember the post 9/11 era, you know, these fears of catastrophic terrorism happening tomorrow, right? And I tell my undergrads who look at me with, you know, blinking eyes, right, that they will, you cannot understand the Bush administration's counterterrorism policies unless you believe that they thought a terrorist attack was going to happen tomorrow, right? Their view was there's an imminent threat looming over us, and that hasn't happened, right? So to me, a clear success, even if, God forbid, tomorrow there's an attack, right? This has been a lot of successes. And I think it's a combination of factors. So it is disrupting jihadist havens. So it's much harder to do that significant training that made the 9/11 sort of thing so deadly. You can't do years-long operations because you're much more likely to be caught. So you can pick up a gun and kill people, right? You can still kill people, I want to stress that, but the kind of, you know, 9/11 itself took at least 2 years to plan, the embassy bombings took 5 years, right? That's a much harder thing. Intelligence cooperation makes it much harder to do multi-country operations. So 9/11 involved, you know, Germans who went to Afghanistan, key meetings in Spain and Malaysia. There was funding coming out of the Gulf states, and the operation, of course, is in the United States. You're much more likely to get caught by someone in a lot of those places today than you were in the pre-9/11 era. So far more people working together, and then much more aggressive homeland defense, right? So in the early 1990s, Ayman Zawahiri, the current head of Al-Qaeda, he went to America to fundraise. Right? Like, that's not going to happen today, right? Like, that just wouldn't be a thing, right? There was a lot going on in the United States in the 1990s that people just didn't care about, that all of a sudden people focused on. You know, the question today is really, is the FBI too aggressive? While the question in the 1990s was, are they aggressive enough? So I think that combination of factors has had a very big impact.
All right. If you're interested, the book is available in the lobby. Otherwise, thank you so much for having us.